Dekvar sat in the corner of the smoky cantina, his massive frame casting shadows across the worn metal table. The old Malthari warriors for battle scars caught the dim light as he slowly turned his drink between his clawed fingers. Each scar told a story of survival, but tonight, Six eyes were focused on something else entirely. At the far table, a group of fresh recruits from different species were celebrating. Their laughter echoed through the cantina as they raised their glasses, talking excitedly about their upcoming deployment.
Yeah.
These young soldiers had no idea what they were walking into. They spoke of humans like they were just another species. In the Galactic Coalition forces, the bear's stomach twisted. He remembered being that naive once. "Another round for the heroes," shouted a young Veltrani recruit, his blue skin gleaming with excitement. "Tomorrow we fight alongside the legendary humans." The word legendary made Dekvar's mandibles click. Involuntarily, legendary. If only they knew what that really meant. "You think you know what you're walking into?" Thatcher muttered, his gravelly voice cutting through their celebration like a blade through silk. The cantina slowly grew quiet as heads turned toward the scarred veteran. Even the bartender, a six-armed Threxian, paused in his glass cleaning. The recruits looked at each other nervously. Everyone in the coalition knew about Commander Theshfar. 23 years of active service. 17 major battles. More commendations than any non-human soldier in recorded history. When he spoke, smart soldiers listened. Problem, old-timer. The Veltrani recruit tried to sound confident, but his voice cracked slightly. His friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Dekvar slowly stood, his 8-foot frame unfolding like a mechanical titan. Each movement was deliberate, calculated. "I served with humans for 7 years," he said, walking toward their table. His footsteps echoed in the sudden silence. "Let me tell you about Sergeant Dong-Hyu." The recruits tried to maintain their brave faces, but Dekvar could smell their fear. Good. Fear might keep them alive. "Kepler Station," Dekvar began, his voice taking on the tone of someone reliving a nightmare. "Outer Rim. Strategic refueling point. The Krillian Empire wanted it bad enough to send their entire Fourth Fleet." He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. The Fourth Fleet was notorious throughout the galaxy. 60 ships. 30,000 of the most brutal warriors the Krillian Empire could produce. "We had 12 soldiers defending that station," the Var continued. 12. Against an army. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The odds calculator said we had a 0.003% chance of survival. Even I was ready to surrender." A young Altarian recruit, barely old enough to serve, whispered, "What happened?" "That's, eyes, 6 eyes, fixed on the boy. Sergeant Dong-Hyu happened." The old warrior's claws scraped against the metal table as he leaned forward. "Picture this. The station's main corridor filled with smoke and the screams of dying soldiers. Emergency lights flashing red, the smell of burned flesh and melted metal everywhere. I was pinned behind a destroyed support beam, plasma fire lighting up the air above my head like a deadly light show." He paused, taking a sip of his drink. "That's when I saw him. This human sergeant couldn't have been more than 25 years old by their standards. Small guy, maybe 5'8". Nothing special to look at. But when the first wave of Krillian shock troops came through that breach, Dekvar's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I watched that human take 17 direct plasma. Bolts to the chest. 17. Each one should have killed him instantly. His armor was melting, fusing with his skin. Blood was streaming down his face, pooling at his feet. The recruits were completely silent now, hanging on every word. Any sane being would have fallen. Should have fallen? But Dong-Hyu? Dekvar shook his head slowly. He just kept firing, kept moving forward, like the pain didn't even register. The old warrior's voice grew rougher. Then his rifle ran out of power. I thought, finally he'll retreat. But this crazy human grabbed a thermal detonator from his belt. With his bare hands, his bare burning hands that were already half melted from the plasma hits. Dekvar stood up again, acting out the memory. He looked at me with these wild eyes and shouted something in their ancient language. Something. About honor and death. Then he charged. Actually charged into a group of 50 Krillian warriors, screaming like some primitive beast. The Veltrani recruits scoffed nervously. "Come on, old man. Humans die like everyone else. They're not invincible." The cantina fell completely silent. Even the background music seemed to stop. Dhekvar's mandibles clicked slowly, ominously, like the sound of approaching death. "That's where you're wrong, boy," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 7 years of nightmares. "That's where you're all wrong." Dhekvar's 6 eyes grew distant as he stared into his drink. The liquid swirled like a miniature storm, reminding him of another battle, another nightmare. The recruits leaned forward, despite their fear. Something about the old warrior's voice commanded attention. "The Vorthan siege," he began, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. The cantina seemed to hold its breath. 3 months of pure hell on a planet that shouldn't exist. Vorthan Prime had acid rain that could melt through military-grade armor in minutes. The gravity was twice what most species could handle. The atmosphere was poison. He paused, letting his claws scrape slowly across the metal table. The sound sent shivers down the spines of everyone listening. We were trapped in Underground Base 7, 200 coalition soldiers from 12 different species, surrounded by 15,000 Krillian ground troops. No way out. No reinforcements coming. Command had written us off as casualties. A young recruit from the insectoid Mantheri species clicked his mandibles nervously. "How long were you trapped?" 97 days, Dhekvar replied, without hesitation. 97 days of constant bombardment. The Krillians had us in a perfect kill box. Every time we tried to break out, they cut us down. Food ran out after week 3. Medical supplies were gone by day 20. Most of us were ready to surrender. He took a long drink, his expression growing darker. That's when Private the Jinn volunteered for the ammunition run. The recruits exchanged glances. They'd heard stories about human suicide missions, but most thought they were exaggerated. The ammunition depot was 6 kilometers away, Dhekvar continued. 6 kilometers through acid rain, past enemy patrols, across a minefield that could turn a tank into scrap metal. The journey would take 6 hours minimum. In that rain, most species would be dead skeletons in 30 minutes. He stood up and walked to the cantina's small window, looking out at the stars. I remember watching her prepare. This tiny human female couldn't have weighed more than 60 kilograms. She wrapped herself in 3 layers of protective gear, knowing it wouldn't be enough. Kissed a picture of her family. Then she looked at all of us and said, "See you for dinner." Dhekvar's voice cracked slightly, like she was just going to the market. The old warrior turned back to face the recruits. I watched her through the periscope as long as I could. The acid rain started eating through her outer layer within the first hour. By hour 2, her helmet was half dissolved. By hour 3, I could see her legs. A Veltrani recruit made a disgusted sound. "You mean her armor?" "No," Dhekvar said grimly. "I mean her legs." The acid had eaten through everything. Her skin was melting off her bones. Literally melting. I could see muscle, then bone, then just raw nerve endings. But she kept crawling, kept moving forward. The silence in the cantina was deafening. Even the bartender had stopped pretending to work. She reached the depot, she had to climb a 15-meter wall, with legs that were more scar tissue than flesh. No skin left. No muscle in some places. Just determination and whatever it is that makes humans refuse to quit. Dhekvar's claws clicked against his glass as he returned to the table. She made it back with enough ammunition to last us 2 weeks, crawled the entire way back, leaving a trail of her own blood and flesh. When we pulled her inside, she was unconscious but still clutching the ammunition crates. "Did she survive?" asked a young Altarian, his voice barely audible. "Not only did she survive," Dhekvar said with something approaching wonder in his voice. "She was back on patrol duty 3 days later, refused to stay in the medical bay. Said her squad needed her." The veteran's expression grew even more haunted. But it was Captain Minho who truly showed me what humans are made of. He sat back down heavily, like the weight of memory was physically crushing him. Day 89. The Krillians had finally broken through our outer defenses. They came in waves, thousands of them, howling their war cries. We were retreating to the emergency bunker when our rear guard position got overrun. The Kvara's voice became mechanical, like he was reading from a report. 17 soldiers cut off from the main group. No way to reach them, no way to help them. Command ordered us to abandon the position and fall back. But Captain Minho prompted one of the recruits. Captain Minho looked at the tactical display, saw his soldiers trapped, saw the enemy closing in. Then he grabbed his combat knife and smiled. Actually smiled. Dekvar shook his head in disbelief. He said, "Tell my wife I kept my promise." Then he sealed the blast door behind us and stayed. The old warrior's voice grew quiet. We heard him fighting for 3 hours after we evacuated.
3 hours.
Over the CUM system, we could hear plasma fire, explosions, screaming, but also something else. Singing. This human was singing old Earth War songs while he fought. A young Zelkari recruit's antennae twitched nervously. How is that possible? One soldier against thousands? Dekvar looked at the young alien with something between pity and respect. When reinforcements finally arrived the next day, they found him sitting on a pile of 47 enemy corpses. Still breathing, still smiling, his knife was worn down to a stub. His armor was completely destroyed. He had cuts and burns over 90% of his body. The veteran paused, letting that image sink in, but he was alive. When they asked him how he survived, you know what he said? The recruits shook their heads, said, "I promised my wife I'd come home." Humans don't break promises. Dekvar finished his drink and set the glass down with finality. Humans don't know when to die. They've forgotten how to quit. It's not courage, it's not training, it's something deeper. Something that makes them keep fighting when every logical thought says to give up. The cantina remained silent for a long moment. Each recruit lost in their own thoughts about what they'd be facing tomorrow. Dekvar's massive frame seemed to shrink. As dark memories flooded back, his 6 eyes lost their focus, staring into a past that still haunted his dreams. The recruits could see his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his glass. "There are some stories," he said slowly, "that change you just by telling them. The massacre at New Soul Colony is one of those stories." The cantina felt colder somehow. Even the background noise from the kitchen had stopped. The old warrior's voice carried a weight that made everyone lean in despite their growing fear. New Soul was a farming colony, Dekvar began. Peaceful. Place, 50,000 humans living simple lives. Growing food, raising families, teaching their children. They had no military defenses, no weapons stronger than hunting rifles. The Krillian High Command knew this. He paused, his claws making small scratches in the metal table. The attack came at night. Orbital bombardment first, then ground troops. But this wasn't a military strike. This was something else. Something darker. Young Manthari recruit shifted uncomfortably. What made it different? His eyes snapped. To the insectoid soldier, they didn't want the colony. They didn't want the resources. They wanted to send a message. To show the galaxy what happened when you stood against the Krillian Empire. The old warrior stood and walked to the wall, where faded holopics showed smiling coalition soldiers from different campaigns. His finger traced one particular image, a young human female with kind eyes and a bright smile. "Lieutenant Borum," he said softly, 23 years old, military intelligence officer, sweetest person I ever met in 7 years of war. She used to give me her dessert rations because she said humans didn't need as much sugar as Maltheri, always asking about my family back home. Dekvar turned back to the recruits, his expression growing darker. She was off-planet when it happened, returning from a reconnaissance mission. Her ship received the distress signal just as they jumped into the system. The veteran's voice became mechanical, like he was reading from an official report. 50,000 civilians, men, women, children, elderly, all dead. But the Krillians didn't just kill them. They made examples, displays, warnings. He sat back down heavily. I was part of the investigation team. We landed 3 days after the attack. The smell hit us before we even left the ship. Death has a smell, you know? It gets into your bones and never leaves. The recruits were completely silent now. Even their breathing seemed too loud. The Krillians had been creative, the Gwar continued, his voice flat and emotionless. They'd arranged the bodies in patterns. Messages written in blood. Children's toys scattered among the corpses. They wanted anyone who found the colony to know this was intentional, planned, enjoyed. A Veltrani recruit made a small sound of disgust. The XR's 6 eyes fixed on him. That's exactly how Lieutenant Bjorn reacted, he said. At first, she ran to the nearest building and threw up. Cried for 10 minutes straight. Thought she was breaking down like most of us were. The old warrior's claws clicked against his glass. But then she stopped crying. Just stopped. She came back out. Something had changed. Her eyes were different. Empty. Like all the warmth had been sucked out of them. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. She didn't say a word for the next 6 hours. Just walked through the colony, taking pictures, making notes, collecting evidence. While the rest of us were trying not to be sick, she was working, hunting. Ekvar's mandibles clicked slowly. That night, she came to me with a datapad, said she'd identified the Krillian units responsible. 17 ships, 4,000 soldiers. She had their names, their ranks, their family histories, everything. Did you do? Asked a young Altarian recruit. I told her to file the report with command. Let the brass handle it. Follow proper channels. Ekvar laughed bitterly. She nodded and smiled. That same sweet smile she always had. Said, of course. Commander? Proper channels. The veteran's expression grew haunted. She disappeared that night. It took a single-person fighter and vanished into space. At first, we thought she'd gone AWOL, maybe had a breakdown. It happens in war. He paused, taking a long drink. 3 weeks later, we got reports of a Krillian patrol ship found drifting in the Omega Sector. No survivors. Security footage showed a single human female boarding the vessel, fighting her way through 60 soldiers like they were children. The recruits exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't sounding like the heroic human stories they'd expected. Then another ship, then another. For 8 months, BRM hunted them. Across 12 star systems. She never slept in the same place twice, never contacted command, never asked for help or supplies. Ekvar's voice grew colder. She studied each target, learned their routines, their weaknesses, their fears. Then she would board their ships alone. No backup, no support. Just her and whatever weapons she could carry. A Zelkari recruit's antennae twitched nervously. How many ships did she destroy? 16, Ekvar replied immediately. 16 ships. 3,847 Krillian soldiers. She kept count. Had their names tattooed on her arms, their faces carved into her armor. The cantina was so quiet that the sound of ice settling in glasses seemed like explosions. The final ship was their command vessel, the Kavar continued. A massive dreadnought with a crew of 800. The ship that had given the orders for New Sol. She spent 2 months learning its patrol routes, its crew schedules, its security protocols. He stood up again, pacing like a caged predator. When she finally made her move, it was during a routine. Supply stop. She went aboard alone. Alone. One human female against 800 of the galaxy's most brutal warriors. The old warrior stopped pacing and faced the recruits directly. 16 hours later, she walked out, covered head to toe in alien blood. Not her blood. Their blood. The ship's computer logs showed she'd killed every single soul aboard. With her bare hands, a young recruit whispered, "How is that possible?" Ekvar's 6 eyes reflected the cantina's dim lighting like pools of ancient fire. Because she wasn't human anymore. She was something else, something that the Krillians had created when they murdered 50,000 innocents. They'd awakened something in humanity that should have stayed buried. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Finally, one of the recruits found his voice. What happened to her? Ekvar sat back down slowly. She disappeared. Some say she's still out there hunting. Others think she died in that final battle, and her body just forgot to stop moving. But I know the truth. He leaned forward, his voice barely audible. she became exactly what the Krillians feared most, a human with nothing left to lose. And that, recruits, is the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. The cantina remained dead silent as the weight of that truth settled over everyone present. Dekvar noticed the fear in the young recruit's eyes and his expression softened slightly. The cantina felt heavy with the weight of his previous stories, but something in his demeanor changed. He sat back down slowly, his massive frame settling into the chair with a gentleness that hadn't been there before. "But humans aren't just monsters," he said softly, his gravelly voice taking on an almost tender tone. "That's what makes them so terrifying and so wonderful at the same time. They can be your worst nightmare or your greatest salvation, sometimes in the same moment." He reached into a worn leather pouch at his side and pulled out a small, faded photograph. The image showed a smiling human female in military fatigues, standing next to the XR himself.
Ow.
Both covered in mud and grinning despite obvious exhaustion. "Corporal Subin," he said, holding the picture so the recruits could see. 26 years old, combat medic. Had a laugh that could make you forget you were in the middle of a war zone. The old warrior's 6 eyes grew warm as he remembered the Battle of Crimson Ridge. 7 days of non-stop fighting in the worst terrain you can imagine. Rocky mountains, constant rain, enemy snipers in every shadow. My unit got separated from the main force during a Krillian counterattack. He pointed to one of his scars, a long mark that ran from his shoulder to his elbow. Plasma rifle burst caught me right here, tore through my armor like paper. The pain was so intense I couldn't move, couldn't think. Just lay there bleeding. While enemy fire lit up the sky above me. A young Altarian recruit leaned forward. "How did you survive?" "Subin found me," Dekvar replied simply. "I was unconscious when she reached me, but I woke up to the sound of her voice. She was calling for a medic evac, but the response came back negative. Too much enemy fire. No safe landing zone." The veteran's claws traced the edge of the photograph. Gently. That's when she made a decision that probably saved my life and changed hers forever. She looked at me with those determined human eyes and said, "Well then, we walk." He paused, letting the implications sink in. 12 kilometers, through active combat zones, while carrying a fully grown Maltheri warrior who weighs 3 times. What she does? The recruits exchanged glances of disbelief. Even among the strongest species in the galaxy, carrying someone 12 kilometers would be a monumental task. "But here's the thing about Subin," Dekvar continued. "She dislocated her shoulder in the initial attack. Her left lung was punctured by shrapnel. She was coughing up blood every few minutes. Any other species would have been in a medical bay for weeks." He stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the stars. "She rigged a makeshift stretcher from debris and started pulling me. For 12 kilometers, through mud, over rocks, past enemy patrols. And you know what she did the entire time?" "What?" whispered a Monthari recruit. "She sang to me," Dekvar said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some old human lullaby about stars and dreams and finding your way home. While plasma bolts tore through the air around us. While explosions shook the ground. While her own blood dripped onto my face. She sang." The cantina was completely silent except for the soft hum of the air recyclers. Every time I tried to tell her to leave me behind, she'd just sang louder. When enemy patrols got close, she'd whisper the words so quietly that only I could hear. That song became my lifeline. As long as I could hear her voice, I knew I was going to survive. Dekvar turned back to face the recruits, his expression a mixture of gratitude and awe. "It took us 14 hours to reach the evacuation point. When we finally got there, Subin collapsed. Hadn't taken a single break, hadn't stopped to rest, or eat, or even catch her breath. She'd used every ounce of strength she had to save someone from another species who she barely knew." A young Veltrani recruit asked, "Did she recover?" Eventually Dekvar nodded, but she never complained. Not once. When I thanked her later, she just smiled and said, "That's what soldiers do for each other." The old warrior sat back down and pulled out another photograph. This one showed a tall, stern-looking human with kind eyes, surrounded by a group of alien soldiers, all sharing what looked like a meal. Major Tejo, he said, holding up the second picture. 42 years old, infantry commander, he had this habit of humming old Earth songs while he cleaned his rifle. His voice grew respectful. During the siege of Omega Base, we were cut off from supply lines for 3 weeks. Food rations were running dangerously low. Command had to implement strict rationing protocols, half rations for everyone. Thekvar's claws clicked against the table as he remembered. But Tejo noticed that some of the wounded aliens were getting weaker, faster than the human soldiers. Different metabolisms, different nutritional needs. Some species can't survive on reduced rations like humans can. The veteran's voice grew, softer, so he started giving away his portions.
At first.
Just a little bit here and there. Then more. By the second week, he wasn't eating at all, just drinking water and taking vitamin supplements. Kree, recruits antennae twitched with concern. For 2 weeks. 2 weeks without food, Thekvar confirmed. I confronted him about it on day 10, told him he was going to collapse if he didn't eat something. You know what he said? Recruits shook their heads. He said, "My people have endured famines before. We know how to be hungry. But my soldiers need strength to fight. A commander who eats while his troops starve isn't worthy of command." Vesh's voice cracked slightly. He lost 23 kilograms during that siege. His uniform hung off him like a tent. But every morning he was still there, still leading, still smiling, still making sure everyone else had what they needed. The old warrior pulled out a third photograph. It's one showing a human female with prosthetic legs playing with a small alien child. "Sergeant Hyjin," he said, his voice filled with something approaching reverence. "Combat engineer. Specialist in explosive ordnance disposal. Had a 6-year-old daughter back on Earth that she talked about constantly." He held up the picture so everyone could see the joy on both faces. The Battle of Nexus 7, urban warfare at its worst. Enemy forces were using civilian buildings as shields, hiding behind non-combatants. During one particularly intense firefight, we heard crying. Vex's expression grew pained. A little Vorthan girl, maybe 4 years old, had gotten separated from her family. She was trapped in the middle of a minefield surrounded by active explosives, enemy snipers on 3 sides. No way to reach her safely. What happened? Asked an Altarian recruit, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer would be both inspiring and heartbreaking. Hyjin looked at that little girl and saw her own daughter, Thekvar replied. Without hesitation, without orders, without backup, she grabbed her disposal kit and started running toward the minefield. The veteran's voice became barely audible. She made it halfway before the first mine went off, took her right leg clean off, but she kept crawling. Second, mine took her left leg. She kept moving forward, pulling herself across the ground with her hands, leaving a trail of blood behind her. The cantina was so quiet that heartbeats seemed loud. She reached that little girl and covered her with her own body, just as the enemy opened fire. Took 17 bullets in the back, protecting a child from a species that was technically our enemy at the time. Thekvar's 6 eyes were bright with unshed tears. When the medics finally reached them, Hyjin was unconscious from blood loss. But that little Vorthan girl was alive and unharmed. The first thing Hyjin asked when she woke up was whether the child was safe. He carefully put the photographs back in his pouch. They fight like demons, but they love like angels. That's what makes humans so impossible to understand and so impossible to forget. In the same species that produced Lieutenant Boram's terrible vengeance, you find people like Subin, Tejo, and Hyjin. The recruits sat in stunned silence, trying to process these contradictions. How could one species be capable of such violence and such compassion? Thekvar looked at each of them in turn. Tomorrow, when you serve alongside humans, you'll see both sides, the monsters and the angels. Sometimes in the same person, sometimes in the same moment. And that's when you'll understand what it really means to fight beside humanity. The old cantina seemed to hold its breath as Thekvar slowly rose from his chair. his massive 8-foot frame unfolded with the careful movement of someone who had seen too many battles, survived too many wars. His ancient joints creaked like old metal under stress, each sound a reminder of the countless conflicts that had shaped him into the legend he'd become. The recruits watched in silence as he stood before them, this scarred veteran whose stories had shattered their naive understanding of what they were about to face. The dim lighting casts long shadows across his battle-worn features, making him look like some ancient god of war delivering final prophecies. "So when you deploy with humans tomorrow," Dekvar began, his voice carrying the weight of 7 years of shared combat, "remember this above all else. They are simultaneously the most terrifying and most beautiful species in the galaxy." He paused, letting his 6 eyes sweep across each young face. Some looked excited, others terrified. All of them were trying to process everything they'd heard. "They will die for you without hesitation," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "They will kill for you without remorse. These aren't contradictions in the human character. They're the same trait expressed in different ways. Uncompromising loyalty." Dekvar reached for his drink, the amber liquid catching the cantina's flickering lights. He drained it in one long swallow, then set the glass down with finality. "Let me tell you about the last 2 humans I served with, Specialist Jiwoo and Private Kungsuk. Sisters, though not by blood." A young Manthari recruit shifted nervously.
Oh, what made them special?
The old warrior's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. "Special? Boy, every human is special in their own terrifying way. But these two, ... He shook his head slowly. "These two redefined what I thought possible." He began walking toward the cantina's exit, his heavy footsteps echoing in the silence. But he moved slowly, deliberately, making sure every recruit could hear his final stories. "The Battle of Kepler Bridge," Dekvar said, his voice taking on the rhythm of a storyteller. "Strategic choke point over a canyon that went down for 3 kilometers. If the enemy crossed that bridge, they'd have access to the entire civilian evacuation route. 50,000 refugees, including children." The recruits followed his movement with their eyes, hanging on every word. "Our orders were simple: hold the bridge at all costs. But we were facing impossible odds. 200 coalition soldiers against 3,000 enemy troops. The math was simple. We were all going to die." Dekvar paused near a faded jalopnik on the wall, showing soldiers from various species in dress uniforms. His claw traced the outline of a small human female with bright, intelligent eyes. That's when Specialist Jiwoo volunteered to hold the bridge alone. The silence in the cantina was absolute. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work to listen. "Alone?" whispered a Veltrani recruit. "Alone," Dekvar confirmed. 1 human female, maybe 55 kilograms soaking wet, against 200 of the galaxy's most brutal warriors. She set up her heavy plasma cannon at the bridge's center point and told us to evacuate the civilians. His voice grew distant, lost in memory. "I told her it was suicide. Told her she'd last maybe 10 minutes against those odds. You know what she said?" The recruits shook their heads. "She said 10 minutes is all those families need to get to safety. That's enough." The Gavar's claws scraped against the wall as he leaned against it. But Jiwoo didn't last 10 minutes. She lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of continuous combat against wave after wave of enemy soldiers. And you know what she did during those 6 hours? He turned to face the recruits directly, his 6 eyes blazing with remembered wonder. She sang opera, right, the entire time. Her voice carried across the battlefield like some ancient war goddess calling down judgment. These beautiful, haunting melodies mixed with the sound of plasma, fire, and explosions. A young Altarian's voice cracked as he asked, "How did she survive so long?" "As she turned that bridge into a killing field," Dekvar replied grimly. "Used the narrow width to funnel enemies into single-file attacks. Every shot was perfect. Every movement calculated. But more than that, she fought with joy. Actual joy. It's like she was exactly where she was meant to be." The old warrior pushed away from the wall and continued toward the exit. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found her still singing, still firing, surrounded by nearly 200 enemy corpses. She'd been shot 43 times, but she was still standing. He paused at a table where a young Zelkari recruit sat frozen with fear, and when they asked her why she sang, she said, "If I'm going to die today, I want to die doing something beautiful." The veteran's expression grew even more serious as he pulled out another faded photograph. This one showed a human female in medical fatigues, her hands steady as she worked on what looked like battlefield surgery equipment. "Private Kyung-sok," he said, holding up the image. "Combat medic," had this habit of humming while she worked. Made even the worst wounds seem less frightening. The Gvar's voice grew clinical, like he was reciting a medical report. Battle of Sigma Station. Urban warfare. I took shrapnel from a fragmentary grenade. 3 pieces, each about the size of my thumb, embedded in my back near my spine. He walked to the center of the cantina, making sure everyone could see him. Field medics said they couldn't operate under combat conditions. Too dangerous, too precise. Said I'd have to wait for evacuation to a proper medical facility. His mandibles clicked with dark humor. Hyun-suk took one look at me and said, "We don't have time for that." Then she did something I'll never forget. The recruits leaned forward, despite themselves. She had shrapnel in her own shoulder. It's about the same size as what was in my back. So she laid down on the operating table next to me, grabbed a combat knife, and started performing surgery on herself. A young recruit made a sound of disbelief. "On herself?" "On herself," Dekvar confirmed. "No anesthesia. No surgical equipment. Just a knife, some basic medical supplies, and unshakable hands." She talked me through her entire procedure while she cut into her own flesh. The veteran's voice grew soft with admiration. She said it was the only way to understand exactly how to remove my shrapnel safely. She needed to feel what the knife would encounter, how the metal had embedded in muscle and tissue. He shook his head slowly. It took her 27 minutes to remove her own shrapnel. Then she cleaned the wound, sealed it with military-grade medical gel, and immediately started operating on me. The Guevara's 6 eyes reflected the cantina's dim lighting like ancient stars. Perfect precision, perfect technique. Saved my life, and probably prevented permanent paralysis. When I asked her how she stayed so calm while cutting into herself, she said, "Pain is just information. You learn to listen to what it's telling you." The old warrior finally reached the cantina's exit. His massive frame filled the doorway as he turned back to face the recruits one final time. An hour later, she was back in combat. Still humming, still saving lives, like nothing had happened. He looked at each recruit individually, making sure his final words would be remembered. "They call it the human spirit," Dekvar said, his voice carrying across the no-silent cantina. "But I call it madness. Beautiful, terrifying madness. You're about to serve alongside legends who don't know their legends." The old warrior's expression grew serious, almost paternal. "Tomorrow, when the shooting starts, when everything goes wrong, when logic says you should give up and die, you'll see something that will change you forever." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You'll see humans do impossible things for no reason other than someone needs them done. You'll watch them sacrifice everything for people they barely know. You'll witness courage so pure and selfless that it makes you question everything you thought you knew about what it means to be alive." The Shar stepped halfway through the doorway, then stopped. "Stay close to them in battle," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly to every corner of the cantina. "There's nowhere safer in the universe than beside a human who's decided you're worth protecting." With that, the legendary veteran walked out into the night, leaving behind only the echo of his footsteps and the weight of his words. The cantina remained silent for long. Minutes after he left, the recruits sat motionless, staring into their drinks, their minds struggling to process everything they'd heard. Some looked terrified, others inspired. All of them understood that their simple view of the galaxy had been forever changed. Tomorrow, they would deploy alongside humanity. Tomorrow, they would discover whether they had the courage to stand beside legends. Finally, one young recruit broke the silence. "Do you think he was telling the truth about all those stories?" An older sergeant from the Threxian Defense Corps, who had been quietly listening from the bar, turned around. His forearms moved as he cleaned glasses, but his ancient eyes held. "The same haunted look as the HFY, kid," the sergeant said softly. "The HFY is famous for only one thing in 7 decades of military service." "What's that?" "He's never told a single lie about what humans can do." The cantina fell silent again as the full implications of that statement settled over the young recruits. Outside, the transport ships were already warming their engines for tomorrow's deployment. Soon, they would learn firsthand why humans had become the most feared and respected warriors in galactic history. The indomitable will of humanity was waiting for them among the stars. The end.